Okay, so before we start this video, I just want to give a huge shout out to Dora, who created the fightlights.com software that we use to program our LEDs. If you want to show your appreciation for the work that they've done, you can donate through the website. We'll be using the configurator later on in the video to program our LEDs, so you should see it. None of the donations go to Furin Arcade. This is purely to show appreciation for the person that made the software that we are going to be using.
So in this guide, we're going to go over changing the profiles of the LEDs that are in your FRS3. It will come with a stock profile where all the buttons will light up as a random color. But if you want to change that and personalize it to what you want, you'll want to follow this guide. So the first thing we're going to need to do is open up the case, which is something you'll know how to do from a previous video. And once we get to this point, we're going to open up the case so that we can get access to here. We're going to remove these two bolts from the Brook PCB and just lift that up from the connector and move that out of the way. And this is our Raspberry Pi Pico.
Okay, so the first thing we need to do is install Thonny. So if we go to thonny.org, the link will be in the description, and we're going to download and install for whatever device you're using. I'm using Windows, so I'm just going to download and install that. It's fairly quick, fairly easy to do, and that should just be on the main page of the Thonny website. Once that's downloaded, we're just going to click the exe file. And it'll bring up an installer, which will be fairly simple to use. Just click next. And I'm going to create a desktop icon just to make it a little bit easier. And we're going to install that. And once we're done with that, click finish, we can close. Okay, so we now should have Thonny on our desktop. So we're just going to open that up. And we need to now plug in our Raspberry Pi Pico from the FRS3. So if we do that now,
we're going to need to take a micro USB cable. This is not the same as the USB-C cable that comes with your FRS3, but this is a fairly standard cable that a lot of Android phones and stuff like that have, and it's readily available in a lot of places. We don't need to hold the boot select or anything like that. We just need to plug the other end of the USB cable into our computer and plug this in to the Raspberry Pi Pico. Your computer will detect the Raspberry Pi, and then we'll move back over to the PC to show how to upload that.
So now that we've got Thonny open and we've got our FRS3 Pico files down here, if they don't show up here, just click the stop button at the top and it will just reset the Pico. I'm just going to create a backup folder just to make sure that we have a backup in case we make any mistakes later on. And then I'm going to navigate to that folder in this top section of Thonny. So I should be able to just click through users, whatever your computer's named as, and desktop. And then we should have the backup folder here, which you should be able to find. Once we've opened that, we can go down to our files here and select all of the config files. You will probably only have two, or if you've done this already before, you'll have more. And I'm just going to right click on that, and it will give me the option to download to, and then the file folder that we've just made the backup. So we'll just download those, and now we have a backup of those for later if we make any mistakes. I'm now going to create a new folder, which I'll just call configs. And what I will do now is we're going to take these config files and create our own profiles, which we'll save in this folder, and then we'll be able to upload them after we're done. So what we're now going to do is move over to the Configurator website. Again, the link is in the description below. Okay, so now we've moved over to fightlights.com website. On the left hand side here, we'll have a configurator, which is going to be the main thing we're going to use to change the profile and change how the LEDs work in our FRS3. So first thing we're going to need to do is load up the file. So top left hand corner here, choose files. I'm going to click that and then just navigate through to the backup folder that we made a moment ago and pick the config file that is the one that we're going to edit. So you'll have probably two on your FRS already, and which version of the config file is saved to a certain profile will change depending on how you've used the FRS. So what we're going to do is we're just going to load one of these config files until we get a green profile color, and that will mean that we know it's the right one. Now I know in this case that mine is the config 2, so I'm going to load that. But if you load yours and it comes up with a different color, blue or white or something like that, just start again and load the other file, and you should get a green profile color here, which is the one that we were using as the standard in the FRS3. So the first thing we're going to do is change that profile color now. So we're going to click on that, and I'm going to change it to red. We've got our RGB values here, which we can see on the right hand side to give us examples of how to get certain colors. These are the colors the LEDs are able to do. So I'm going to go red. So I'm just going to do 255, 0, and 0. So now when I'm changing my profile, when we have the FRS3 put together again and we're changing the profiles via the controller itself, this profile will come up as red, which is how I'll know this is the one that we just worked on. So as you look through this page, you'll see a lot of different options for how the profiles can be set up, and there's little help icons for most of the parts here. A lot of this stuff you won't need to change at all, but for those of you that are a bit more experienced with this kind of thing, you can feel free to try out a lot of the different options available here and change the main sort of the way that configuration works. And you can always experiment with that, upload it to your FRS3, see what the profile comes out like, and if it's something that you want it, you can always leave it. But for now, we're just going to go through some of the basics of changing the colors and the idle animation and stuff like that. So we're going to start with the colors that show up when we press the button itself. So you'll see that there'll be a list here of all of the buttons that we have available to us. Now, as you go through this, you'll notice that some of them are marked as blank. Now, this means that the LED that this refers to is not one that you have a button for in your layout. Obviously, all the layouts are different, so there'll be different ones depending on how yours is set out. But in this case, we can see that EX1A is blank, which means that the layout I'm using doesn't have that. And we want to leave those as blank. The reason for that is if we change that to a different color, when we press another button, this LED might light up as well, which is not something we want because it will show up underneath the artwork that you have where there's no button. It kind of will look a little bit weird. So in your list, if it shows as blank, just leave it as blank unless you're changing your layouts or anything like that. But for the rest of the buttons, we can change the color. We don't want to change this at all. Brightness we can leave because we can change the brightness via the controller itself. Although if you for some reason want one LED to be brighter than the others, you can always change these values. The fade in and out values here is again something you're probably not going to want to edit because in most cases when you're using your controller, you'll want the buttons to light up immediately. Otherwise, it'll be a case of holding down the button to have it fade in, which is something that when you're playing, you're probably not gonna want. If you do decide to change these and you want these to work in some way, you just need to click this checkbox, which will mean that the buttons will fade in and out. But I'm going to leave that unchecked for now. So in terms of changing the colors, you'll see that all the buttons are listed on the left hand side. They might look like they're in a bit of a weird order, but that's down to the LED positions, which is dependent on the controller. But you'll have all your buttons listed. So we're going to start with EX3, and I'm going to change the color of that. I'm just going to resize this window just so I can see everything clearly. We've got a little drop-down menu here, and we can use that drop-down menu to change the color of that button. So when I press EX3, if I want it to be green, I can pick green. If I don't want it to light up at all, we can pick blank. And if we want it to show a different color each time we press it, we can click random. So I'm just going to pick green for now. And we can do that with all of the buttons that we have here. And the next thing we're going to look at is the background colors. So in the default profile that you'll get, it will be checked here as clear background on color press. So what that means is that when you press a button, medium kick for example, all the other LEDs will turn off. I have it set to that just because that's a kind of a standard, but if we don't want that to be the case, we're going to uncheck that, and that'll mean that when you press the button, it will light up with whatever color you've set it as, but all the other lights will remain on. And if we want to change what the background colors are in that case, we can click this button here and we'll be able to show it here. Now in this case, we've got background colors set to rainbow, so it'll be the same as the idle animation. But we can go through these and we can click one, select a color for it. So if we want all the buttons to be red in the background, we can set them to red and change the brightness and stuff like that. I'm going to set these back to how they were before, but you can play around with that and see how it looks. Once you're done with that, let's click close, and now the background colors will be set. I'm going to recheck this box because we don't want the background colors on, but if you want the background colors, leave that unchecked. Okay, so the next thing that we might want to change is the idle mode. We can disable that completely by just clicking this checkbox, and that'll mean that none of the lights light up while they're not in use, and they'll only light up when you press the button. But we have a number of different modes here, and what these do, it'll have a different animation. We use the rainbow, which kind of just cycles through them, but you might want to check out some of the other ones and see what they do, what they look like, and if they're the ones that you want. I'm going to leave it as rainbow for now. And the next step down, enter idle mode after however many seconds. I set that to 0, so as soon as you're not pressing the button, the idle mode will come on. But you might want to set that as 10 seconds or something like that, so that when you're playing, the idle mode doesn't come on. But when you set the controller down after 10 seconds, the idle mode will start up. Now, one thing that we do need to do here, and this will always be the last thing that we do, is exclude LEDs in idle mode. So we're going to make sure that we do everything else we need to do first. So if you want to change any of the other options and change the colors of your buttons when you press them, do those first. And then when we're finishing up, we're going to go to exclude LEDs in idle mode, and this will bring up a number of check boxes which will have the LED numbers. And what we're going to do is we're going to check all the LEDs that we don't have on our particular layout. The reason for this is we don't want those to light up in idle mode, because if you don't have that button, it'll just be a random LED lighting up from underneath the artwork, and it won't look good with which buttons are lighting up and all that kind of stuff. Now, the best thing to do for this, I've found, is to go through the list here and write down the LEDs that we need, and then we can do them all in one go, because when we click these and then click close, that'll be the ones that are excluded. But when we open it up again, they might still be checked, or they might not, but we just want to make sure that when we're done, we've got them all checked. We click close here. So in this case, the first thing I'm going to do is I'm going to find all the ones that currently say blank, and I'm going to write those down somewhere. So LED number 4, LED number 14, and in this layout, those are the only ones we have that aren't that are already inactive. And we also want to go through and look for any switches that we don't have that aren't marked as blank. So in this case, an EX5, the layout that I'm using does not have an EX5. So I'm also going to write down number 12 and so on and so on. And we find all the lights that we want to not work at all in our idle mode. And then we'll go here and we're going to click here, LED 4 and then 12. And what was the other one? 14. So 4, 12, and 14. Close. And that will just make sure that our idle animation doesn't show LEDs that we don't want showing up. So that covers the most common options that people are going to want for their LEDs, what colors they are when they're pressed, what the idle animation does, and stuff like that. A lot of this stuff we're not really going to want to change, but you might want to experiment with this. The main thing is just keep those old config files in a separate backup folder. If you change something and it doesn't quite work, we can always go back and start again. The LED option mode, this is how we access our option mode within the controller itself. So I would probably leave that as is, because that'll be what I refer to as buttons you'll need to press in order to get to the menu, but you can always change this if you want to. Once we're finished and we're happy with the profile we've created, we're just going to go down to go up to the right hand corner here at the top and click download code. Now that's going to download a config file which will just be named config.py. And what we're going to do is show you now how to re-upload that to your Raspberry Pi Pico inside the FRS3 and how to set it up from there. So what we're going to do now is create a config file if we haven't done that already. And we're going to put our config files into here. So in this case, I'm going to go to download and I'm just going to copy that across into the config files. So all the ones that we create will be here. So let's say that we've created a few different options. They'll all come up in here. Now what we want to do naming wise is it's probably best in the config file that you name this as whatever option you chose. So let's say we made all our buttons be red, just something that you're going to remember it as and leave that in the file itself. We're going to need to change this later, but this will just help us remember which ones are which and all that kind of stuff. So when we're finished and we've created the config files that we want, we'll just put them into this folder and then we can upload them from there. So now we're going to look at Thonny again, and we're going to upload our config files to what we already have. So like I said at the start of this video, make sure that you have these config files backed up, because what we're now going to do is all the files that say config and end in .py, we're going to select those and we're going to delete them from this section, and we're going to these will be deleted completely. They won't go to a trash bin, so make sure you back them up first. Delete those. Now what we can do is upload our config files back into here. So in order to do that, we're going to do that from this top part. But what I'm going to do to make things easier for myself is I'm going to take the config files that we already had that are in our backup folder, and I'm going to copy those into the config files that we've made here. So we have 4 config files. This was the one that this red one here is the one that we made earlier. And what I'm going to do is I'm going to leave the ones that were already there named exactly how they are named. And I'm going to change the name of the ones that we've worked on to be config and then whatever the next number is. So in this case, it's going to be config 3, no space, and then .py. Now what this is going to do is this is going to give us, in this case, a 4th config file that we'll be able to cycle through. Once you have the config files and you know that you're happy with them, you can always delete the other ones later. It's usually best to keep these in here because you can always change the config files from the controller itself. So deleting them is kind of unnecessary. But the main thing is that the Raspberry Pi Pico, when you change the profile that you're using, it will rename these config files. So when you select this one, which is the one we were just doing, it will rename it to config, and it will swap the current config to config 3, and so on and so on. So when you actually download them again from the Pico, they might be named differently, which is why we're always going to take the files from our backup, put them into our config, and rename them, and then use them from here. And then that way we don't get confused as to what config file does what. So once they're in the file that we made on the desktop, and they are named like so, config.py, config1.py, and so on, we can close that down now, and we're going to navigate to that folder in Thonny. So we're going to use the navigator here. I'm going to go to desktop. We have config, and then that will have all the files here. I'm just going to select those, use shift to select them all, right click, and then upload to. Now this might say upload to /, or it might say upload to Raspberry Pi Pico, but this will just mean whichever Raspberry Pi we have plugged in. So I'm just going to click that, and it will now upload the config files, and you'll be able to see them here. So we now have 4 config files available. That all do something different. And once we've done that, we're now done with the software side of the LED profiles. So we're just going to click stop, which will just reset everything, and then we can unplug our FRS3 Pico, and we can continue changing things on the controller itself.
So once we've done all that, we can unplug our Pico here, and we can plug back in our Brook PCB into the connectors here, and you'll want to put the bolts back in place to hold that in place. And then we're going to put our panels back on and test the new profile that we've made. So when we do that, we're going to take the left hand side, plug in our LED wire, and plug that back in, and our right hand side, plug in the LEDs, put that in place, and then we're just going to take our USB-C and plug that into our FRS3, and we'll take the other end of that and plug it into our computer. So once we've got everything put back together, we want to probably leave the top plexi off first, just to make sure that we can test our profiles before we put everything back together and have to take it apart again if we want to make any changes. So just a reminder from the LED basics video, we want to hold down the left and right button, as well as the P1, K2 and P3, so punch 1, kick 2 and punch 3 buttons. Hold all of those down for a couple of seconds, and that'll take us to the menu within the controller itself. So as a reminder, P3 and K3 will cycle through our profiles that we've made. So we have a few options on this demo unit, but whatever we set our profile color to, that will show up on the LEDs. So if you set your profile color to blue when we were making it, or red, or however you set it, that will come up now. And then if you hit the K1 button to enter, that will program your LEDs with the profile that you have set. And then you can test that all the buttons light up in the color that you wanted, that the idle animation works the way you wanted, and so on. And if not, we can just restart the process, change the profile again, re-upload it, and go from there. Once you've done that, if you're happy with the way that it's turned out and everything like that, you can just go back, putting the plexi on, if everything's plugged in and set up as normal. And that's how you change the profile of your LED buttons in the Furin FRS3.